Оккульт, просвет.
So how are you?
Well, Deanna, I'm quite well, actually. Yes, yes. Um, and thank you very much for the invitation to be interviewed by your good self. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Well, it's not my questions. I ask all my questions privately usually, but yeah, my followers got a lot of questions for you. Okay, the first question: is it possible to work in another profession while practicing magic, or should magic be a full-time specialty? There is opinion that magician must practice magic 24/7, but in such case, where does one get to live? So yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a strong position in Russian occult scene that you either hardcore or there is no place for you. So, what is your opinion about that?
Well, um, I think magic, as much as anything, is an attitude to being in the world. And so you might be an artist and a magician. You might be a doctor or a nurse and a magician. You might be an architect and a magician. And you would be able to bring your insights from magic into those fields. And I would suggest that that won't be very helpful. Um, because if you work in designing spaces or you work in helping people heal or any of those kinds of things, I think that the ideas and experiences from magic will inform and enrich what you do. So, for example, I worked for many years, for about 20 years. I worked in museums and galleries, and I worked as a consultant helping those organizations find ways to help their visitors connect with the artworks or the objects in their collections. So my job was to stimulate people's curiosity. That was essentially my job. And there were many things from the magical work that I'm involved with, which became very useful in uh, that type of work, because magic is about exploring the mystery of how it is that we are here having this conversation at all, the strangeness of the world. And so I was able to design games and practices to help people explore museums informed by that. So I don't think there's any necessity for magicians to just be magicians. Equally, if you're an artist and you're a creative practitioner of some description, many people who are celebrated as artists now were very informed and influenced by the occult, the surrealists, the Dadaists, many different traditions of artistic style. So no, I don't think that you have to be uh, a magician by profession, but I think if you're a magician, you are always a magician, whether you are being an artist or an architect or a nurse.
I think also they wonder about the case like a personal life and this the relationships and friends and I don't know parties or whatever.
I suppose if we also think of magic as being about relationship with spirits, that's another way of thinking about magic. The spirits that most of us encounter most of the time, and the spirits that have the greatest influence on us are other humans, by and large. So the magician is, I think, more likely to be somebody who is skilled at relating to other people. And so those types of relationships that we have with other people, those are where a lot of the kind of the skill of magic can be said to sort of to dwell. So it's not about kind of separating yourself from the world. Quite the reverse, I would say. It's about being really fully present
I
and
totally
enriched
agree.
by the world.
I totally agree. For me, that would definitely work out that way. If I'm interconnected with my friends, traveling parties, and things I really love, that makes it makes magic more real and more. I don't know. It's much more practical and valuable. Otherwise, if you're just there in your monastic state, I don't know, meditating and doing magic, then you just get crazy. You,
If magic is about enhancing the world in some sense, then yes, you want to be part of the world. If magic is about relationship with spirit beings, relationships with other humans are really essential. The way that we manage those, all the complexity, and the situations in which we find ourselves. That's what it's about. It's not about cutting yourself off from the world. I agree with you. It's quite the reverse of that in my experience, anyway.
I totally agree. And so, how did you come to magic? And did you manifest it unconsciously? And how did you realize that was what you want to dedicate your life to?
I don't remember a time when I was not interested in magic. So from the earliest time that I remember, I had always been fascinated. Anything that I could find in newspapers or the television, and then later on, when I got a little bit older, in my local library, the books and the information I could come across, I sucked up everything that I could find that was related to magic in its broadest sense. I was interested in anomalous phenomena. I was interested in all kinds of things on the sort of the edges of human experience. I was very interested in mythology. I was very interested in parapsychology, and also just interested in psychology. What was this thing that I was, this kind of being that I was, that I became, that I am, you know?
Yeah.
And so I've always been interested in it. So either you can be romantic about that and say that perhaps it was a reincarnatory memory or a vocation, or you could be more sanguine about it and say that perhaps it was a mental illness. But whatever it was, I started uh, finding all the information that I could about magic, and I started writing it down. So I have still in my possession now a large number of notebooks that I started from the age of 9 onwards, where I collected everything I could find: magical alphabets, astrological information. I taught myself how to do astrology when I was about 12 years of age. This is way before you had computers, or in fact, even calculators. So,
You could do
uh,
this map by hand.
yes. It is indeed possible to do it without a computer. It is a thing. You have a big book of tables called an ephemeris where you have to do calculations, and that's what I taught myself, all of this stuff. I taught myself um, all the symbolism that I could find from the Western magical tradition. I made a great catalogue of all the folk magic that I could find, and I started experimenting with things. Started experimenting with different types of altered states of consciousness, with meditation, with yoga and other practices, dowsing, earth energies, all that sort of stuff. So that by the time I was about 12, 13, I started making contact with other practitioners. And by the time I was 16, I was a member of a Wiccan coven. So it's always been my thing. It's always been something that's fascinated me.
So I guess it somehow answers on the question: what would you recommend to young chaos magician? What techniques do you use daily, for instance?
So one of my favorite quotes about magic is from dear old Aleister Crowley, where he writes, if the magician's pyramid would touch the stars, how broad must be its base? So if the magician's pyramid is going to touch the stars, how broad must be its base? He goes on to say that basically everything that you can learn and explore about the universe is worthwhile doing. Now, there are certain fundamental things that I think are helpful. One thing I think is helpful as a general practice, which I try and do every day, is to make some time to be aware of what my awareness is doing. So that looks like what I call vanilla style, vanilla flavor meditation. So no guided imagery, no staring at a yantra, nothing complicated, just literally noticing breath, being still, sitting, noticing breath, noticing when my awareness moves away from my breath, noticing that my awareness has moved away, recognizing that and gently guiding my awareness back to my breath, and basically just repeating that process. So Zazen meditation, just sitting, mindfulness meditation, very simple practice where what we're training is not the ability not to think, because a human mind does that. It doesn't matter who you are. If you put the Dalai Lama in a brain scanner, I guarantee there's brain activity in that guy's head. It's about learning to notice where your awareness is. That's what's being trained. So meditation, daily meditation, ideally a minimum of 20 minutes of meditation every day, is, I think, a really helpful foundation practice. But then, because the pyramid needs to be really broad, there are so many other things that we can do. We might go through periods of time where we do other practices, and periods of time where we change them up in different ways. But another practice I think that in some way needs to be present all the time is a practice with the body. So that might look like yoga or qigong, tai chi. It might look like being in the gym, but being really present with the whole practice, being very much in the body, listening to the body. So a lot of what magic is about noticing stuff that other people tend not to notice. So noticing what's happening in the body is really, really useful. I think another practice that I find helpful is to have some kind of centering practice. So the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, is probably the best known. But as you and I know, there are all sorts of different variants of that. The Gnostic pentagram ritual, designed by Pete Carroll, is one I quite like. But there are ones that I've used over the years from other traditions and practices as well. But a practice that kind of draws us back to the center in some sense. So a practice where we listen to what awareness is doing, and a practice where we pay great attention to the body, and a practice which allows us to kind of come into the center. And then beyond that, the practices involve things like, in the broadest sense, working with spirits and working with the imagination. And I think it's important, or I find it helpful, that every day there is an opportunity for me to be exploring some of those kinds of things. Yeah, so this is very much the foundation. We can talk about elaborate rituals and magic circles and all kinds of things, and that's perhaps part of the practice. But just like caring for ourselves, brushing our hair, cleaning our teeth, there are these basic things: being aware of where awareness is, being attentive to the body, having practices that bring us into the center. Those are three things that I think are really, really key.
Yeah, I agree. I have a recent video about it, actually. It's quite interesting. And I mean, my followers start to just mock me that a question to my every advice is gonna be looking like meditate. So yeah.
Yeah. You see, one of the things about magic that I think is really interesting, and this was certainly the case for me as a young man, is that you become understandably really excited in the idea of sort of, gods and spirits and rituals and paraphernalia and all these things. And then I think as you do these practices, you start to realize that a lot of what's actually being worked with is things like attention and the imagination and sensitivity. And those skills are being developed. So, for example, if you want to work with spirits, you could stand in a magic circle and you could wave your arms around and you could do all the things, and that might be fantastic. But another way of learning to work with spirits is to realize that if you go, for example, into a woodland, you go and sit by a rock pool near the side of the ocean, and you look around waiting for all the animals and creatures that are going to be in that environment, but you only sit there for a minute, the chances of you seeing anything are very small. If you walk into a woodland and you are still, and you allow yourself to settle, and you allow the environment around yourself to settle, then you can start to become aware of what's going on. So if you want to work with spirits, you have to learn to listen. You have to learn to calm the mind. You have to learn to deploy the imagination. You have to learn to be persistent. So that can be trained as easily by going into the woodland and being still and waiting and being observant and noticing what's happening in that environment, becoming sensitive to it. That's a really, really useful skill. And it doesn't look like anything involving circles and paraphernalia and so
That's
Those
in
things,
Utesitnik in Nordic tradition also.
a lot of these traditions, I mean, if you think about all the major religious teachers, one of the things that they all have in common pretty much is they all go off for a period of time on their own. Something happens, they have an insight, they meet an angel on top of a mountain, or they meet and contend with the devil in the desert, or they sit under a tree for a long time until they have an insight. So this idea of kind of going off on your own, going into a space where something changes, some sort of relationship changes with, spirit beings or whatever you want to call them, and then you come back and tell everyone else what you've discovered. Those kinds of opportunities for us to we get very caught up in our own story, and if the story you're telling yourself is, I'm going to be a powerful magician, I'm going to be a powerful magician, what I have to do is I have to buy all these books, what I have to do is I have to learn all these things, I have to do all these different types of rituals. In a way, one might suggest that whilst that is part of the process, that's a little bit like becoming excited by the costumes you could wear if you were an actor, but without actually studying acting. Yeah, acting as a skill can be done by somebody irrespective of whatever clothes they're wearing. A good Shakespearean actor can put you into the experience of being with Hamlet or being with Falstaff or one of the other characters, irrespective of how they're dressed. So the clothing around magic, all of the imagery and the iconography of magic is valuable and useful, but it's only valuable and useful because it's a way of accelerating or structuring those underlying processes of what we do with awareness. Yeah, in the same way that the actor's costume doesn't make them a great actor. It just makes them a person wearing a costume.
Yes, I don't agree. And maybe that's kind of a little question. How to overcome imposter syndrome?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, one thing I suppose is, because magic is also another way of thinking of magic is about understanding the hidden structures in the universe, the hidden processes in the universe. And so in order to understand that, one of the things that we have to understand is, here we are, we're apes, we're hominids. We have all sorts of stuff that is built into our biology and is built into our neurology. And that might, for example, include imposter syndrome. It might also include things like megalomania. That's another capacity that we have. And so how do we navigate the fact that we have this hominid brain, that we have this human brain, we have all of those tendencies? I suppose the first thing to recognize is, well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually part of, there are parts of that that are maybe a self-protective mechanism to stop becoming too ego inflated. Right? But there are also parts of that which can be debilitating, can weaken us because we don't think that we have the authority or that we have yet the skill or whatever. And that's why, one of the powers of the magician is to dare, to recognize our human frailties and the possibility of failure, but nevertheless to try, to try and go beyond those things and maybe find techniques that allow us to kind of manage that feeling. In some respects, you could talk about these feelings as demons. One of the ideas, one of the ways of describing demons, which Lionel Snell Ramsey Jukes does very well, is to talk about them as kind of subroutines in the brain, like little programs that run. They're very helpful. They're very, very good as systems in our minds to allow us to live our lives. The problem with those demons, the problem with those systems, is that they can become too dominant, too powerful, too significant. So if we believe that and we feed this demon, which is called our imposter syndrome, of course, eventually it means that we are unable to do anything. So we want to kind of keep this, we don't want to destroy this thing, because it's useful to kind of question, do I have the skills to do this? Have I done enough study? Am I the right person to do this? That's good. That's self-reflection. But if the demon becomes too big, it means that we don't do anything. And then we never even start or try. So maybe it's about having this thing recognizing that it's part of who you are. It doesn't need to be destroyed, but it does need to be built into some kind of system, some sort of magical understanding of the self, where it can be a servant that's helpful and not a bad master.
I totally agree. I was suffering with it a lot, but then I just okay, that's probably a good kind of a navigator to not become too too ego inflated. I agree, not just simply to not become a jerk.
Yeah.
And have you faced failure in your work despite of your experience?
I guess it's an interesting question, isn't it? Have I faced failure? When I thought about that question, I was wondering about what failure would look like exactly. So I suppose with all of the magical work that one does, in a way, there's always a result. And the result might be that nothing happens or it didn't work. And in a sense, I suppose that's a failure. But then it's rather like learning anything, you know, that the failures, the things that didn't work, are then the opportunities to kind of go, okay, so what do I need to do differently? What do I need to understand in another way? So I tend not to think of things as you know, I can think of examples of magical work that I've done where you know, in hindsight, I would have done things differently. But I've learned from those things. I've learned from those opportunities. You know, it's like if you're an artist and you're producing lots of work, there might be a painting that you do that you think that's not quite right. It's not what I wanted to express, but that's still a necessary part of the process. So whether it's a failure is kind of open to question, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, it depends how you take it. Totally agree. Well, there is a question like, what spirits have you worked with? But I know as myself, I would probably struggle to answer that because it's, I mean, it's so many usually, and it's just like you work with like a concept with separate consciousness with so many paradigms to approach it. So, do you have a clear answer to that?
There are lots of ways we can think about what a spirit is, and I know some of the questions were about, you know, what are these things, which is always a good question to ask.
And there is such question.
Yeah. So I mean, okay, okay, I tend to think that any sufficiently complex system which can which can arise into awareness as an apparently external entity with whom I can have an interaction is a spirit. So in this moment, as we're having this conversation, I recognize that you are a spirit. You know, you're a separate self-arising entity with your own thoughts and volition and so on. Now, of course, practically speaking, you're actually just a set of pixels and movements of light and dark on a computer screen. But nevertheless, because I'm a human and I have a relational psyche, because I'm a hominid, and that's an important part of what we're working with here. If we were starfish magicians, we would be doing magic in a different way, but we're monkey magicians, so we do it in this way. And so our ability to relate to things as people, as beings, means that we can interact with all kinds of spirits. So we can have the spirit of a tree. We could have the spirit of a mythological being. We can have the spirit of a time, of a country, of a library. So any sufficiently complex system that is able to arise in my awareness as an apparently external thing that I can have an interaction with is a spirit, in my view. And so spirits are not so much things in the world, they are styles of relating to the world. So I'm relating to you exactly as I would if you were in this room. And actually, we're in different physical locations, and you're just a collection of pixels. But because, you know, I believe in you essentially, and I believe in the reality of the experience that I'm having here. So in the same way, if I walk into a museum or a gallery, so the word museum in English means shrine to the muses. So it's a shrine to the spirits of inspiration. So I could walk into a museum, and when I was working in museums, although I wouldn't use this language, this is what I would do. I would say to people, the building we're going to walk into now is a space which is full of spirits. It's full of stories. It's full of objects. It's full of paintings and artworks and so on. And we can have an interaction with a particular object, a particular spirit associated with an object in that room, or we could have an interaction with the whole of the museum as a spirit being. So spirits are, as much as anything else, they're a style of relating to the world. So you can go to a book of mythology and find lists of all kinds of different spirit entities, but you could equally have an interaction with the spirit of the morning in which you find yourself waking up somewhere. And the morning itself, the experience of being in that thing, of wherever you found yourself, you know, you're a well-traveled individual. Here you are waking up and hearing the soundscape of a new place. And you begin to have a sense, because you're a magical practitioner, of the kind of spirit of this place. Yeah, because you're perceiving this thing in a certain kind of a way. Because what we do in magic is we use that perception in order to have these interactions, in order to learn new stuff about ourselves and the world.
Yeah, the one part of that question, I mean, like there was a question about what's nature of gods, but also like how you explain that it's egregores and structures, and the person is asking, is it, in your opinion, they are created by humans, or are they real beings that originally exist on another plane of existence, either laughing at us or tactfully using us as a chess piece?
It's a very, very good question. I think, okay, so the first thing is I think that we have a problem here. So we have a problem with a lot of our language and our perception. So we know, just practically speaking, we know that our eyes can only see a small amount of the visual spectrum. Yeah, what we call the visual spectrum. We know that there's lots of electromagnetic radiation that we can't kind of perceive. And so when we start to talk about spirits, one of the difficulties that we have is we're talking about things that I think are actually kind of, they sort of underlie reality. They're the basis from which the apparently separate objects appear. So I'll give you another example. So here I am, I'm one person, Julian Vane, and I have a particular narrative and a particular story. I was born in 1968, you know, I'm going to go through my life and things will unfold and so on. But actually, of course, I'm a colony organism. I'm actually made of lots and lots of sort of, you know, bacteria and viruses and all kinds of things. You know, there are creatures living in my eyebrows. So I'm actually a colony, but I don't appear to be like that. I appear to be this single separate thing. So I have a suspicion, because I'm a panpsychist or an animist. So I think that kind of the underlying structure of the universe is, let's call it something like awareness. And then the individual things that jut out of that awareness that exist for a certain period of time, called Diana or called Julian, whatever they happen to be, they're like these kind of waves on the ocean. They're like these kind of tiny points. So are they real? Yes. Are they separate? Kind of, yes. But are they basically the same thing? Yes. It's rather like if someone was looking at you and I from the geological time record, there would be no difference between us. We're just hominids. We're just Homo sapiens. You know, we're basically the same. But in this conversation, we're quite different because we're the people interacting in this kind of a way. So I think that when we talk about questions like, are they real, are they not real, it's actually much more complicated than that. We can't, there's not two compartments in the universe called the real things and the not real things. It's much, much more complex.
We are coming to a Platonic philosophy now, I think. I feel.
Well, we're certainly coming to a place where it's rather like, you know, we like the visual spectrum. We see a particular slice through the universe. When I perceive myself as one thing, and yet I know that in the 56 years of my life, the atoms in my body have changed. A lot of my views and my perceptions have changed, and that I'm this colony organism. So it kind of depends where you look at these things from. So in one sense, when we encounter a spirit, we can look at it psychologically. We can obviously look at it from a kind of an animist point of view. We can use the paradigms of information magic or of energy magic to understand what's going on. But we can only ever see, rather like it would be in the same way that we can only see one side of an object. We can't simultaneously see the whole thing. And so a lot of these questions about are they real, are they not real? I think that there's an assumption in that question that there are these not real things or there are these real things. And I just think that it's a much more complex and subtle picture than that.
Yeah. Can this let us, I don't know, can this lead us to the discussing psychedelics in that sense then, if we broaden our perception and in various dimensions why we are on the psychedelics? It like gives you some hints how much are you missing, or is all created by your mind, but in that state kind of, okay, does it really matter? So, but anyways, how much psychedelics influence on mental abilities? There is a question like that, and in that context, yeah, what is risk and benefits of it?
Okay, so as you know, I'm very interested in psychedelics. So I've been involved with them for quite some time, including as a research participant in licensed experiments and so on. I think that what psychedelics do is they allow us to, in some sense, let's talk about it in terms of the dream world, right? So if we think about dreams, are dreams real? Yes. People report dreams all the time. Are dreams real? Yes, they're absolutely a real phenomenon. They're a real subjective phenomenon. Not everybody else isn't lying about dreams. The dreams are a real phenomenon. Do dreams happen in your head? Yes, kind of. But are dreams influenced by what's happened in the day? You know, if you've traveled on a boat, you know that you will probably dream about the rocking sensation of being on a boat when you're dreaming. So your dreams are partly made by your experiences, the real experiences of your life. Can dreams contain information which you're not consciously aware of? Yes, undoubtedly. Both things that you can think of as psychological, or maybe things you could think of as parapsychological. So what psychedelics do, in a way, is they allow us to go into this dream state, which is actually always happening all the time. But consciousness, waking consciousness, is rather like the sun. So when the sun comes out, the stars disappear. Now, the stars are still there. It's just you can't see them because of the sun. So when you have your individual awareness, I'm just Julian and here's my story and I'm awake and I'm doing things, there's a whole bunch of other processes unfolding. But like having the sun in the daytime, I don't notice any of that stuff. When I take psychedelics, one of the things that happens is that my normal state of awareness, it basically starts to break down. And this dream state, which is actually with us all the time, with all of the strangeness and all of the beauty and all of the insights and the associations that come with it, they emerge into awareness. So it's rather like, you know, being able to temporarily turn down the volume turn down the brightness on the sun so that the stars become
Stars on
apparent.
LSD, it's the most beautiful thing I ever seen.
And yes, and that's one of the other interesting things. There's an idea from it's used by a lot of people, but it's probably best known by the British novelist writer Aldous Huxley. So he talks about this idea of mind at large and the reducing valve. So his idea, or the idea he talks about, is the notion that we're continuously bathed in this complex sensory input, all the many billions of bits of information that are floating around us all the time. But actually, in order to live our lives and in order to get on aeroplanes and in order to have conversations on Zoom, what we do is we narrow our focus of attention so we are just looking at one thing. So we have this idea of mind at large is our experience of the world. And then we have this valve that reduces all of that down to just a tiny little trickle, which is what we need to basically be able to get on airplanes
You know,
and have Zoom
actually,
conversations.
physically, we constantly see in our nose, but the brain blocks it out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you can see how a lot of this is built internally. A great example of that is that if you have two eyes, you have depth perception. And if you cover one of your eyes, you still have depth perception, even though depth perception is based primarily around having two eyes. So your brain is still quite cheerfully building the world with depth perception. But what happens with humans with this idea of mind at large is this notion that the reducing valve comes down so we can just get on with our day. And when we use magical techniques, of which I would include psychedelics as one of those, this is a way of opening the valve back up. So we start to perceive things in this very different way. When we walk into the museum, we don't simply see it as a boring building made of stone with a bunch of old stuff in it. We perceive it as a living structure, as perhaps a spirit, as perhaps an entity. We perceive the internal process in our minds, not simply as a narrative about what it is we think we're doing, but we turn the volume on that down, we turn the brightness on the sun down, and again, we start to see this mind at large. We start to see all this bigger collection of information. And in that bigger collection of information, we notice some things. We notice, for example, how everything in the universe at least feels like it's connected to everything else. There's a great sense of relationship that emerges in those spaces. They're the kind of hyper-associative spaces. And magic, one of the sort of axioms of magic, one of the self-evident truths of magic that it's predicated on, is that although there can be things in the universe that look like they're separate, actually they're intimately related, every single part of this. And that mind somehow, perhaps because it's the underlying awareness, it can move in this space, you know?
Yes, and that's also kind of leads to another question about the astral realm and the realm we see under the influence of psychedelics are the same. Do we go into the same realm with different drugs or not? Or it's like, where is the astral realm? Can we get there on LSD?
I don't know. I mean, you know, one of the things I often say about this is that for me, a lot of magic is a repertoire of techniques for exploring things and for experimenting with things. It's not very good at giving answers about, you know, is this thing the same as this thing? Partly because if you look at the word astral realm, historically and culturally, that phrase has a meaning, has a series of associations. So the Golden Dawn, for example, when they talked about the astral, they were very much talking about it in terms of, let's say, path working. So using the Hermetic Kabbalah, traveling in a series of guided imagery meditations to find particular places and locations, perhaps rather like being in the dream world, being in being in the territory of the imagination. So do psychedelics get us into that same territory? Yes, I would say that they, broadly speaking, they do. We know that the brain states that psychedelics create are similar to brain states that we get in other types of altered states of consciousness, whether we're doing breath work or in certain types of meditation or other types of ritual work and so on. Whether or not there's an exact relationship between the astral and the psychedelic world, I think it's open to question. We would have to explore, what does this concept mean and what does this concept mean? And more than are they the same, magic is more interested in how can we work with these ideas. Yeah, a lot of magic is praxeological. It's about doing something. So when someone comes along and says to you, oh well, let me explain to you how it works, any aspect of magic, to some extent, I think that they've missed the point, because the point about magic is it's about your own exploration of these ideas. That's why the second card in the deck, in the tarot, is the magician, and the magician is standing there at the table with all of the stuff. And what they've got is they've got all the tools that they need to do magic. Yeah, they haven't necessarily got, you know, the bumper book of answers, the big book of answers, the grimoire of all truth. You know, that's not what they're doing. What they're standing at, like at the laboratory, they are going to explore. They are going to discover this for themselves. That's why magic is not the same as religion, because religion, by and large, and again, this is a broad description, by and large, religion comes along and says, let me tell you what the answer is. Let me tell you what you should believe. Let me tell you what the holy book is. Let me tell you where you should do all these things. Magic says, here's a bunch of techniques. No one really knows how it works. That's part of the reason we call it magic. We're radically uncertain about how this works. But there are techniques you can try. One of them is called path working. Allegedly, it takes you to the astral realm. Another one is called psychedelics. Perhaps it takes you to the same place, or perhaps something different. Perhaps it would take you to the same place when you're in your 20s, but not when you're in your 60s. Who knows?
Yeah.
But the technique is there for you to try, and you have to make sense of this because you are the magician standing at the altar with all the tools necessary.
Yeah, but despite of that, Golden Dawn created so many structures and directives. And that's the question about these founders of magic were men, even considering that two main tarot systems were created by men. Well, not actually.
Oh, what? No, you see, okay, so right. If we look at the Golden Dawn and we say this is a very hierarchical system, this is very sort of, you know, it's very complex, therefore it's male. Well, I'm not sure that that follows because, you know, why should that be a male domain? The second thing about the Golden Dawn is that the Golden Dawn is only not a boring Masonic organization because it let women in, which was brilliant, because without the women, the Golden Dawn would have been nothing. If you think about things like Annie Horniman, Florence Farr, you know,
in Russia there is this the Waite Smith deck is called just Rider Waite.
So we all know that it should be called the Smith Waite deck or the Rider Smith Waite if we really want to, because Rider is the name of the publisher. Arthur Edward wrote the book, and Pamela Coleman Smith, a magician of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, designed the designs. Published in 1909, one of the most important modern tarot. Absolutely. And when we talk about the tarot, you know, so there is Pamela Coleman Smith, our artist. When Crowley does his tarot, Crowley is going to do a tarot which is basically the same as the previous version. It's Frieda Harris, the artist, who encourages him to put all of his ideas into this new tarot. And she's the creator of this tarot. You know, in a way, Crowley is her muse, reversing the usual way that we have the artist muse as being the woman. So I would actually argue that the Golden Dawn has a lot of influence, important influence from women. There's a book by Mary K. Greer called Women of the Golden Dawn, which I would recommend, where she takes, I think, 4 of the magicians of the Golden Dawn, female magicians, and she writes about their history and their story. So yes, it's a very systematized thing, but I think that's less about it being male. It's more about it being Victorian. The Victorians loved nothing more than measuring people's heads and drawing lines on maps and collecting things. So of course, that's how it looks. It's not that because it's masculine and male. It's that because it's colonialist Victorian England.
Which sounds a bit male to me.
And the empress of the empire is Victoria herself, after which the age is named. So you could argue it's patriarchal. Yeah, definitely you could start to make an argument about that. But then what's interesting actually is that lays the groundwork for a whole bunch of like 20th century magic and then 21st century magic, which has, you know, lots of which has kind of like radical ideas about like gender and identity and all kinds of things in it. And so that system, even if it was patriarchal, was able to be the fertile soil in which a number of other important ideas would grow. So I don't know. I think the women of the Golden Dawn are really, really important in our story. And
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, yes, there is a lot of maybe not obvious lines going on, not obvious from the outsider. But anyways, yeah, all this vertical structure, and I think also it influence on the perception of the astral realms. It's like how the Sephiroth tree builds up and so built down. So it's like, yeah, so the astral is yes, you saw it, so it's really right above you. So it's like physical emanation of the deity or whoever he is.
I mean, I think that's true. But if you look at the Kabbalah, I mean, firstly, the the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, the kind of the standard diagram that we tend to see, that's only one way of representing the tree of life, and it is emanationist. So it starts off with nothing, and it goes through a series of phases to create the universe. But unless that universe gets created, in a way, the first cause doesn't exist. Because, and then in the series of initiations of the Golden Dawn, we work back from Malkuth all the way back to Kether, and it's in that, it's rather like in meditation. It's the movement of awareness from the breath to the fact that you are now thinking about your emails that you have to send, to noticing that, to going back to the breath. It's that movement. That's actually where the power is. The power is not in the hierarchical structure. It's in the movement between these zones within the system, which can be represented as a series of 10 balls and 22 sticks, but it could equally be represented as a concentric series of circles. And within each one of those spheres is another tree of life. So it's a fractal as well. So I think that when we start to look at it, we kind of see this hierarchical ladder. But then I think when we start to explore that system a little bit further, we realize that actually what we're looking at is we're looking at a series of relationships, that Malkuth is not less important than Kether. You know, Kether is not sort of the thing about Kether is that Kether is it doesn't have any kind of outpouring into form until it reaches further down into the tree, and it's that gives rise to the complexity of the world. So I think that the system itself, although it has this kind of emanationist features to it, again, it's more subtle and it's more complex than that very sort of one-dimensional view of it.
Oh, I agree. I struggle a little bit with some concepts in there, but for sure, I kind of don't deny that it's very versatile and can be used in a variations ways. I don't know. So yeah.
I think the Kabbalah is interesting. If you think of it more like the chakras, so the chakra system, the root chakra and the crown chakra are just part of the whole of the organism. So yes, you know, there are or if you think of a human body, you know, the relative sort of significance of the heart or the lungs or the eyes or the brain or whatever, it hangs together as one body. You know, it's often referred to as the anatomy of the body of God. So like in the chakras, it's not that you're trying to reach the crown chakra and you're trying to ignore the root chakra, that the root chakra is somehow bad or wrong or sinful or something like this. The point is that it's the whole thing working together in the same way that it's the combination of a heart and a brain and lungs and all of those things that come together as one body, you know? So it's confusing function and relationship with value judgment about whether things are good or bad. And the whole idea of dividing the universe into things like good or bad is just as naive as dividing it into ideas of real and not real.
I totally agree with that. And what's your take on the science in that way?
So if what science is historically is science is a way of trying to understand the underlying structures in the world. So we see objects moving through space. We throw a ball and it moves a certain way. And then we discover that we can calculate trajectories and we can look at gravity and we can do mathematics to understand how things work. And we can start to understand these hidden features of the universe. Or if we're doing psychology, we're doing science in terms of psychology, we can start to understand why humans make the choices they make because of the kind of cognitive structures, the mental structures that they have. So this is very, very much like magic. And historically, it's absolutely magic. So if you go back to the dawn of the Royal Society for Science, the first officially modern scientific organization, as far as I'm aware, on the planet, in the way that we talk about science now, that all of the people involved in that are interested in magic. Isaac Newton, who is the first head of the Royal Society, writes more about astrology and alchemy than he writes about what now we call gravity. Because that same idea of trying to see the underlying structures of the universe and doing that through experimentation, which is what science is about, is very much the same as magic, historically and culturally. What the magician does when the magician explores psychedelics or ritual drama or centering, banishing practices, or whatever they're doing, is they're doing an experiment in order to see if they can understand the underlying structure of perhaps their psychology or the astral or whatever language we want to use. So they're trying something out. So the advent of science in the 17th century is based on the idea that as lots of people are having lots of different religious beliefs, the Christianity is coming into has already come into contact with things like Islam, Judaism as a feature of the culture as well. So there are multiple religious ideas. And so people start to think, well, perhaps if we want to understand the mind of God, then what we need to do is not look at books which probably were written by people, even if they claim to have been written by God. But what we do need to look at is we need to look at the world that we live in, because at least in the 17th century, we would all agree that that's the creation of God. So if you want to understand how God exists, how the divine exists, or the sacred, or whatever word you want to use, I like you, God is not my favorite word for that. But if we want to understand this underlying series of structures, rather than just listening to the tales told to us by goat herders from the Middle East, we would be much better off by actually exploring the world itself. That's where we're going to find our answers, not in books written by men. And we're going to find our answers by experiment, not by just listening to what a bunch of other men have told us that we should be believing.
Yes, I agree. And but yeah, so far anyway, and unfortunately, what I see, it's still quite a strong dogma in that field. And I don't want to, yeah, but my opinion about OTO, which is everywhere, is a bit harsh, maybe, on that take about the chauvinistic approach to all this gender roles and male, and it's how it's all built up. For me, it's a bit tough.
Yeah. I agree. I agree. And that's why it's to be able to challenge those things and question those things, I think is really, really important. One of the things about chaos magic as an approach to magic, and I remember one of the questions being, why is chaos magic a thing for you? Chaos magic historically grows out of the idea that people wanted to experiment with magic, but they didn't want to do it in the sort of Western ceremonial, very Christian influenced tradition. Whether or not that was the kind of satanic goetic version or whether or not it was the very transcendental white light version. They also didn't want to do magic in the way that Wicca existed, with its duo theology of God and goddess and its ideas about karma and threefold laws of return and things like this. And neither did they want to be Thelemites. Neither did they want to basically be followers of the idea that Aleister Crowley was the prophet of a new religion, incidentally, which comes with old school, old-fashioned Egyptian deities, but that's another issue. So Chaos Magic wanted to kind of say, well, maybe we can do magic without theology. Maybe we can do magic without religion. You know, is it possible to explore magic just in its own terms rather than believing that the Book of the Law is the answer, or the Book of Shadows is the answer, or the Bible is the answer? You know, it's more about, again, experimentation, which is one of the reasons I think it's really interesting as a system. You know, I have a lot of time for the work of Aleister Crowley, but I also think that in many respects, he does exactly what a psychologist would imagine that he would do. He was a man who idolized his father, who was a fire and brimstone preacher. And when his father died of cancer of the tongue, when Crowley was a boy, Crowley, hating the hypocrisy of Victorian England, wanted to kind of break away from that. But you don't have to be a psychologist, as I know you are, to realize that it's unsurprising that then later on, as he gets older, he basically reinvents a patriarchal religion and becomes its prophet. So he kind of lives up to his father's aspirations in some respects, but just in a very different and strange way.
I agree totally. Well, I think, but discussions on the Russian occult, it's a bit different. So yeah, that's a harsh take, I think, but I love it.
I mean, you know, I gave an Aleister Crowley quote at the earlier on in this interview because there are many things about him that I think are really great.
No, me
But
too.
but
I
again,
would
if you
say
look,
that I respect him. He's quite
yeah,
a really interesting character, and he's a trickster of this historical period, and that's great.
but
Uh,
he's also a very damaged individual. He's also someone who had an abusive childhood, and so unsurprisingly, he's very unbalanced in a variety of senses. And the fact that he creates a new religion, albeit a religion that, like, you know, it's interesting because Crowley throughout his writing says, you've got to find your own way, you've got to find your own way, you've got to find your own way, and then says, and this is the law, let me tell you what it is. And it's like, you know, no, no, Alistair, no.
yes, exactly. Well, there is I came across on OTO resources in Russia that their opinion that IoT derived from OTO.
No, quite the reverse.
Yeah,
Quite the reverse.
I don't
Quite the
know.
reverse. As I mentioned, the IoT, in fact, if you read early editions of Chaos International, the magazine that was being published by the IoT, effectively at the time, you'll see there are articles, there are pieces in there which are about which are basically Pete Carroll saying, oh, loads of people are leaving the OTO in order to join the IoT. And partly that's just marketing, right? That's just marketing, pure and simple. But it's also about this idea that they wanted to create an approach to magic which didn't have to have theology. It didn't have to have a book of the law. It didn't have to have a prophet. It didn't have to have special magic holy days when he, you know, he was when the text was channeled to him in April, or particular kind of rituals. And I actually think that Crowley, a lot of Crowley's rituals for me don't really work terribly well. They are basically Golden Dawn rituals with new names put in. So they're essentially the same architecture. They're exactly the same ritual structure, and they don't have anything very useful or interesting to say, in my opinion. Now, many people really probably find many of those rituals very moving, very impressive. They do something for them. And I've certainly experimented with a number of the rituals that Crowley's given. The other thing about Crowley, though, is that there's a lot of Crowley that we don't know. So there's a psychedelic Crowley, and we don't know very much about that at all.
Why?
We know that Aleister Crowley was using mescaline between 1907 and 1917 and was running regular mescaline ceremonies, mescaline rituals. And the ritual that he did, the Rites of Eleusis, which is probably pretty much the first public psychedelic ritual in the Western world since the closing of the Temple of Eleusis in the end of the 4th century AD. So Crowley was absolutely radical, and I think that had he had more opportunity to experiment with psychedelics, he would have been probably more experimental and more develop more interesting rituals. Certainly, he starts to do that with sex. He starts to have a very interesting kind of orientation around this idea of sexual magic. But I think that he was very much kind of still embedded in the kind of old school patriarchal Victorian magic that he was raised in. He desperately tries to sort of push into something new, and I think that because of the work he did, we don't have to follow him. That's the point. That's kind of the point.
Yeah,
It's like
okay.
we shouldn't follow him because we are the ones standing in front of the altar with the magical tools. We have to make our magic for these times now. And I think that what Crowley did that was great was to set up conditions which allowed those new things to flourish. Just like the Golden Dawn itself, it created the soil into which these new ideas could start to develop. And for that, it's very, very valuable. His work is very valuable indeed.
But now it grows a little bit in a different direction. More, I don't know. It's so weird. It should be becoming more open and, let's say, queer, but it's not really going there. They try, even though on Western part of they try, but I don't think they try that much in Eastern Europe yet.
I mean, this is Aleister Crowley, who, despite coming from such an abusive background and being basically, he's very wealthy. He's from the elite. He's from a very hypocritical background as well. He's simultaneously brilliant and also really stupid and annoying. He's kind of the Elon Musk of the occult, basically. So
Yes.
so a lot of what he does is really important because it leads to the things that we can do next, including his explorations of sexuality. When he was in the Abbey of Thelema, he was doing cross-dressing and calling himself Alice and trying to seduce his students. I mean, it doesn't get much queerer than that.
Yeah. And I don't really understand it. Even this kind of hint of queerness, it feels like they removed it in the later practice. I don't, or at least what I met, I've been on this few masses and everything. I don't see anything freeing about them at all. They're
No.
just so realistic.
I mean, again, I have plenty of friends involved in OTO and plenty of friends involved in Thelema, and I've attended and done a lot of these rituals myself. But the Gnostic Mass is a really interesting example. So in the Gnostic Mass, as I'm sure you know, so this is Liber 15, which is the number of the devil in the tarot trumps, and this is Crowley, who is a Protestant, comes from a Protestant background, a very hardcore evangelical Protestant background, playing with Catholicism in much the same way that Oscar Wilde played with Catholicism as a it involves dressing up and it involves incense. What's not to like. And then he writes a ritual that includes a series of lists of saints, which has all kinds of people in it, and of course him, where he's referred to as Sir Aleister Crowley. And we're expected to do this ritual with a straight face. I mean, it's a brilliant, brilliant piece of comedy. That fantastic, hilarious. But I mean, whether or not that necessarily has to be a ritual which we believe is the ritual for like the new Aeon, when it looks fundamentally like a Catholic Mass, because it's a parody of the Catholic Mass. It's a kind of satanic schlock version, like a humorous version almost of the Mass. It's a parody, it's a joke. In the same way that in his Liber ABA, there's a section where he talks about the magical weapons, and halfway through a discussion of the magical weapons, he breaks off to do a chapter called An Interlude, where he talks about children's nursery rhymes and does close Kabbalistic analysis of children's nursery rhymes in order to explain the mysteries of the universe. This man has a sense of humor. And so the idea of just copying him because it's the work of Aleister Crowley rather than building on his work doesn't work for me.
For sure, in Russian occult, they take it seriously. I think this idea take this practice as a joke and with a little bit of chaos paradigm approach that will not be accepted, but maybe someday. Let's see. How do there is a question also if you do you know anything about Russian occult?
No, no, very, very, very little. I think I've got a couple of books about Russian occulture, and of course, I've had the great benefit of speaking with you about it, but I don't know much about its story at all. And I'm saddened by that for a variety of reasons. One reason I'm saddened by it is because, as someone interested in psychedelics, I suspect that there's a lot of kind of interesting historical and cultural story about the use of psychedelics in Eastern Europe and in Russia, which are unknown to me. So Ivan Bilbin's artwork from, I think, the early part of the 1930s, if memory serves, early part of the 20th century, which seems to have liberty cap mushrooms on it, which were not identified as psychedelic in the West until much later. So I'm interested in Russian occultism. I'm interested in the, how that culture is, and I know little about it. I hope very much that more Russian-speaking occultists and more occultists from the West can find good ways of sharing ideas, because we are also part of the point about magic is because it's experimental, because it's about praxis, it's about doing things. What we need to share is we can share our opinions, just as I'm doing now, and that's all very well. But what I would really like to know is I'd like to know more about the kind of techniques and methods and approaches used by Russian occultists, because I'm sure that there is lots and lots that I can learn from that part of the occult world.
I agree. There are a lot of interesting traditions and so on, but just quite a toxic environment, I would say. But well,
I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that. I think it's interesting to think about how, I don't know the culture in Russia. It's a big place with lots and lots of different groups of people, so it's hard.
I would say even just not like Russia, but Russian speaking, whatever is.
Yeah. So I think that the magic that we are able to do is, of course, it's influenced by the culture in which we find ourselves, and it's interesting actually, sort of thinking about how, going back to that question about should a magician be a magician all the time, which is basically a kind of capitalist question in the sense that it's about should you be a full-time magician, not just in terms of your practice, but is that how you earn your money? Is that what you should do? Whereas I actually think, as I mentioned, that magic is like part of one's life, and that can appear in all kinds of different domains, kind of different work that we might do, or different practices that we might be interested in. So the question about making money as a magician, making money as an occultist, or dedicating yourself to these kinds of things, that makes me wonder about the kind of cultural space in which that comes. Why does that culture invite those questions? Whereas if I look at, say, a lot of English-speaking occulture, particularly in the United States, magic is seen as being a kind of it has ideas about enhancing your life, and it has ideas about like finding out who you truly are. So American occulture is very interested in the idea of authentic self. And again, as a chaos magician, I would question whether or not authentic self is even a thing. So the magic that we have is conditioned to some extent by our culture. So if we can reach outside of our culture and we can find other styles of occulture that we might learn from, then like Crowley, we have a magician building a pyramid which has a very broad base, and that's what we want.
I agree with this capitalistic approach, and I think that's exactly what makes the Russian occult a very toxic environment. Because I think the most of the problems comes from the competition, and that the space of the Russian occult stage is really small. And especially if we talk about not just new age stuff like astrological huge channels or some tarot cards channels and all this meditation and stuff, but specifically like some kind of a more left hand practices or even this OTO, let's say. And there is absolutely no understanding, in my opinion, what is chaos magic and Russian stage, because I get questions all the time which really confuses me, let's say. So for example, I don't know, there is like chaos magic is perceived more as something really even chthonic, or it connected to Tiamat and to Leviathan and these kind of ideas. So this
Right.
kind of chaos. So yeah, of course it is there as well as anything else. And but this idea that it should be this really super dark and kind of a brutal thing. And
No.
when I came with my humor there and saying that this is chaos magic, I've been like, what? No.
So those people who believe that, they need to go and learn about a tradition called Discordianism, which is very much an American tradition, you know, but has there are parallels with the work of a number of different people, you know, in fact, including Crowley's work and Gurdjieff's work and various others, where we use humor and we use a kind of crazy wisdom to shock us out of our complacency, to take that valve, the reducing valve of mind at large, and blow it open. And one of the ways that we can do that is we can do that with this humor, with this silliness, with this wildness, with this fun. If your magical practice leads to you being very sad and glum and thinking that you have to be austere and that you have to, like, that sounds awfully like just the same old stuff that we've been sold again and again and again.
And that's what I'm trying to explain. Isn't it time for change? It's like there should be some kind of little revolutions in here as well.
Yeah.
Make it more open, free, and experimental, and just explore. And exploring, it's all about magic. Is about exploring, not learning some rules, because there are no freaking rules. It's not.
What there are, and this is one of the lovely things about chaos. If you think of the word chaos, one of the most interesting ways to think about it is in terms of fractals. So when chaos magic was emerging, one of the sort of the influences in the culture that ended up calling it chaos magic was the influence of complex nonlinear dynamics. So chaos mathematics. What does chaos mathematics do? Chaos mathematics shows us that in what appear to be random things like the movement of air in the atmosphere and the patterns of weather, or the way that organic systems grow, that although you can't predict exactly what an individual system is going to do, you can see these underlying patterns. So if you look at the veins in your arm and you look at the way that the veins grow through your arm, and then you look at a tree, you'll see that although they're not identical, there's a similarity there. There's a branching set of patterns. So chaos mathematics says, even in the complicated nature of the world, there are these underlying hidden structures. And those underlying hidden structures, those are the things that are really interesting. This is again that idea of, like, if magic is about finding the underlying hidden part of the universe, then that's, you know, this is what it's fascinated with. So, for example, one of the things that chaos magic says in the early work of Pete Carroll is they say, well, it doesn't matter what belief system you have. It doesn't matter whether or not you're Russian Orthodox Christian, or whether or not you're doing voodoo, or whether or not you're doing Santeria, or whether or not you're doing rune magic. that whatever those things are, although they might look very different on the surface, there are underlying patterns, underlying structures. And those underlying structures are often to do with how we change awareness, and what symbols we link to that awareness changing. And very often what symbols are being fed by the change of awareness. And so what chaos magic does is it's not about this kind of, you know, straightforward sort of dark left-hand path, chthonic, you know, all of that. It's much more multicolored than that. You know, Austin Osman Spare famously was asked whether he was a black magician once, and he said, all magic is colorful. And I agree, all magic is colorful. Magic is about seeing the color in the world, seeing these different flavors that exist. They're kind of hidden within these different traditions. Some religions hide the technology of how they work really carefully. Some provide it more overtly. So if you take Buddhism, for example, when Buddha goes off on his own and goes and does his vision quest, he's the only person out of Buddha, Muhammad, Jesus, and Moses, of all of those four, it's only Buddha that gives us a technology. Buddha says, I did meditation, let's start there. And that's one of the reasons that I, as a magician, say, well, actually, one of the places to start is meditation, because that's a technique. It's a method. It doesn't tell me what I should think. It doesn't tell me what I should believe. It just tells me a method. Sit still. Notice your breath. Notice where awareness goes. Notice that your awareness is somewhere else. Gently guide your awareness back to breath. See how it repeats. Observe what's happening here. See what you discover. Yeah. So the whole point about chaos magic is actually multicolored. It's really rich. It's not just about, you know, dark stuff. It's about seeing these underlying patterns in the universe, which can be as present in the wing of the butterfly as in the flapping of the bat.
Yes. And I think this state, when as a chaos magician as well, you explore new paradigms and everything, and you kind of integrate it through meditation and not controlling, but being aware of your awareness. And that's where you find the switch between the realms, whether they are above you or it's just the change of perspective or the paradigm. So that's where you find your way to switch to astral realm or whatever realm. And maybe psychedelics also kind of teach on that a little bit, because when you are truly focused on, because for me psychedelics, they show me how my perception works. They don't take me to space like they show that all space is me. Basically it's there, and that's how you switch the paradigm. So the astral realm is not above me, it's just you just switch your awareness, and that's there you are.
Yeah. I think that's very much the case. I mean, let's give a really simple. We did that stuff earlier on about sort of, you know, depth perception and how we see the world and our predictions and the way that the mind is predictive. So one of the things that happens when we take psychedelics is if you have your eyes open and you have a psychedelic that's very visual, very often the edges of things in the world might look like they're moving, might look like objects are breathing. Right? It's very, very common. So what you might say is, oh, well, actually, that's, you know, things aren't actually breathing. So this is a hallucination. This is a delusion. Now, actually, the way that the eye and the brain work is that we have systems in the brain that have edge detection in the visual system. And in fact, all of the objects that you're looking at right now are all moving in and out all the time, because that's how your perceptual architecture works. And just like with the whole thing about having binocular vision, the depth perception, your brain sort of says, well, that's not how it is. And it sort of smooths out all of that stuff. In the same way that we know that when we're born as infants, the image of the world that we have is actually up the other way because of the way that the light enters our eyes and hits the retina. And then we learn that it's the way up that it actually is. And when we take psychedelics, all of those perceptual structures start to break down. And so what we're seeing is actually what our actual perception is like. This is actually how mind at large is. This is how the perceptual network is. it is difficult to do driving. You probably best avoid it. You know, it would be hard to, the Zoom call might not work as easily, and getting on an aircraft would be tricky. But this is actually how your perceptual architecture is. So in a way, taking psychedelics is an opportunity to see what is more real than all the stuff which is kind of done. Like most of consciousness happens in post-production. You know, it's like video editing. You know, it's all done in post-production. That's actually where it is. And so if you want to take away those perceptual filters and you want to see how the world is, at least in some sense, psychedelics is one way of doing it. But that ability to alter consciousness is a technique. The technique is, here is a substance. This substance will work on the serotonin system in the body. Or here's another practice, what we call meditation. Here's something else that we call dramatic ritual, or drumming, or sexuality, or, you know, what are all these different methods? They don't give us the answer. They're not meant to give us the answer. They're ways of asking the question. That's what they're for.
Oh yeah, and that's another quite common and absolutely permanent discussions also on my channel. Where is that truth? And and yeah, I mean, of course, I know your answer, and I totally agree with that there is no truth, and I see it's like there might be no truth, let's say, and yeah, I don't see the point of searching it. It's just the thing is of the exploration itself. That's the main goal, isn't it? I mean, like, so what you're gonna do is you find your answers, let's say. Okay. The game is over then, I guess.
Well, I guess so. It's also, you know, it's like you know, having a sort of a one-to-one mapping or relationship between experience and meaning is really strange. If I go for a walk and I see a tree, I can say, what does this tree mean? What's the tree mean? Well, the tree means any number of things depending on what my relationship is with the tree. The tree means the opportunity to build a building, or the tree means the beauty of how the tree looks with the sunlight behind it. So it's not as simple as things having these kind of defined meanings. It's in the same way that, you know, what's the point of meditation? Meditation is an exploration of what awareness does. Ceremony, interacting with spirits, all of these practices are ways of expressing and exploring the world. Yes, they might give us answers, but the answers will only ever be temporary. The answers will be a kind of something that gives us an understanding that leads to the next possibility, the next kind of unfolding.
You just find some sort of a concept to comprehend what's going on. Okay, so
yeah.
This is my paradigm for today. It works for me today, but it might stop work tomorrow.
If we have an encounter in, let's say, a psychedelic encounter or a spirit encounter in some other kind of situation, now we know that in the moment of the interaction, in our encounter with the spirit in the scrying mirror or in our minds or wherever it happens to be, we are best served by interacting with that being just in the same way that I'm interacting with you now. Just we interact with it as a real separate thing. When we are outside of that experience, we might reflect on it. We might say, oh, well, I can see how psychologically it was influenced by this, or it was influenced by what I was reading, or it was influenced by where I was, you know, where I was staying at the time, or whatever. So the analytical process, the process of breaking things down in order to understand them, that's absolutely valuable and useful. But that's like the whole thing. We go back to Baphomet with like Solvay and Coagula. We want to be able to break things down, to analyze things. That's useful. But also what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to synthesize and build things up. And more important than that, we recognize these are two aspects of the same thing. So as we continually explore and we have our encounters with spirits or with aspects of ourselves or our attention or whatever it happens to be, we make sense of things. Of course, we make sense of things. And also we realize there's something beyond that. Because one of the things that magic is about, and I think that in rune magic, we see it's articulated really well, the idea that the runes are fragments of mystery. So mystery, the reason we call it the occult, that which is hidden, literally, is that we might understand what we think we understand, and that's great. But what we should understand is there's something beyond that. And then if we understand that, we should understand that there's something beyond that, which is why any occultist who comes to you to say, let me tell you what the answer is, has completely missed the point, in my opinion.
In my opinion, absolutely too. that's and that's I found a little bit difficult to talk about sometimes on the environment I am trying to operate for now, at least. But let's see where the path bring me. So this super, I mean, with the Solvay coagula, so like science a little bit stuck to somewhere on the previous stage, maybe. So we're just separating things and trying to figure out what is the truth. So do you think that this solution will some kind of a diffusion will come later when the occult, let's say esotericism or esoterical approach and so on will be combined back with science or not?
So I think it's that certainly, I mean, I get to hang out with quite a lot of scientists, particularly people interested in psychedelics, but in other fields as well. And I would say that the kind of science that we're talking about, this very sort of mechanistic, objectivist science, that's passing away. I would say that that's passing away. I would say that that's actually been slowly moving away. Well, definitely in a big way since the latter part of the 20th century, because I know that, for example, with let's say the research work that's been done on psychedelics, we've got very, very good models now of what happens in the brain when we put certain types of chemical into the brain. We know exactly what receptor sites are activated. We know how neuroplasticity is initiated and so on. But that doesn't really tell us anything very much about the subjective experience of psychedelics. And most scientists are really aware of the fact that it's more about layers of description. So we can talk about the chemistry, and that's part of what's going on, but that's not all of what's going on. So to give you another example, it used to be said that if you were depressed, it was because there was something wrong with the serotonin system in your brain, right? And now nobody who's actually working in these kinds of fields really believes that. So we know that there's a relationship. Yes, there's definitely a relationship between serotonin and depression, but there's just equally as an important relationship, possibly more important, between the individual and the community that they're part of. Because the serotonin isn't just inside your head, the serotonin exists within the social domain. In the same way that the language that we have, or in your case, the languages that we have, these are given to us from our ancestors. So in a way, language is what we make thoughts of in our own brains. But where does language live? Does it just live inside our own brain? No, because it's come from the outside. It's come from culture that we inhabit, the language traditions that we become part of. So most scientists, I think now, don't see things in this kind of very reductionist, materialist, simplistic, objectivist way, because it's obvious to anyone who's bothered to do any research, certainly in the last sort of 40, 50 years, that the world is more complicated than that. So I think that in terms of what you're saying about, like, you know, science and magic coming together, I think there's a lot more of that, actually. So the big psychedelics conference that I'm involved in, Breaking Convention, happens in April of this year. And there will be lots and lots of scientists there, and there will be lots of magicians there as well. And these people are collaborating. This is absolutely the case.
Yes,
so
it's amazing.
yeah,
I hope I will come this year as well.
I hope you can. Hope you can.
So there was a question also which you kind of partially answered. The path of magic more about solitude or a community or free individuals?
Just like our religious teachers, there are times when we go off on our own, and those are very useful, yeah, potentially. But a human has to exist within a community. If you take an infant human and you don't give it human touch, it will die. If you don't expose it to language, it will not really become fully human the way that we might think of these things. So is it about the community? Yes. Is it about the individual? Yes. Does and again, if we take these simplistic binaries and we say, you know, is it this thing or is it this thing? Well, the whole part of the point of chaos magic, part of the point certainly of 20th century and late 20th century, 21st century magic is to say, no, these are just parts of the same thing, you know, or these are flows between these processes. So it's not about, is it about individualism? Is it about the collective? The answer is yes, it is both about individualism and it's about the collective. Of course, how could it be anything other than that?
And that's the thing about this fluidness. It's which is probably sometimes difficult to comprehend. Not for me, but I understand when I try to communicate these ideas that all this is just interconnection. We just fluid. We change the paradigms. We just like swim through all these ideas and so on and combine, and we're exploring the ways we interact with the universe, the world. That's the whole idea behind Chaos Magic. There was more questions, but I think partially answered to them, and otherwise they will just drag conversation somewhere else. But also is about the noticing what influence you, the way you answer the questions, and I understand that I am definitely so much influenced by you, or I think it the same way. I don't know, because there are a few there are a few key phrases where I understand that I sound like that. So and I'm thinking, okay, was it that my thought, or maybe I just picked up from Julian?
But you see, I don't know that they're my thoughts either, because you know, all of my thoughts, just like my language, it's like, yes, I have my individual language that I make, but that language itself has come to me from others, and my thoughts have evolved within this ecology of the other magical practitioners that I have the great honor of working with. So I'm writing a book at the moment, and one of the things that I've written sort of pretty early on in the book is I've said, look, you know, this is a book written by me, but obviously what I'm doing is I'm bringing lots of other ideas from other practitioners. I hope I'm representing them well. I hope I'm explaining them successfully. But ultimately, and maybe this is kind of the challenge that you've got with, from what you've told me, some aspects of Russian-speaking occultism, which is that the important part about this is it's about actually empowering people to find their way, not to just take something down off the shelf and say, oh, this is the answer. Because if you want to do that, there's whole bunches of religions that will do that for you, right? If that's really what you want. And for some people, for some of the time, that's great. You know, it's not a judgment about how terrible that is. But if you want to be an occultist, you probably have a library of many books. You have many ideas, and they're designed to help you find your way. You know, I must create my own system or be enslaved by another man's, which is what William Blake wrote. So this is the point about it. And that's part of the reason that I think that if an occultist is kind of like trying to define these things really clearly, you know, I question that. I'm much more interested in people who come along and say to me, here's this technique that I found useful. Here's this approach that I found interesting. Here's this method. You know, it's like you do with when you're learning to write or to paint. Like if the person who was teaching you painting just gave you, you know, the paints and said, this is how you should move the brush. Okay, this is how I should move the brush. How will you discover your own art? Of course, you have to be influenced by other people. Of course, you have to learn some of the basic kind of skills. But unless that comes with a message of empowerment for you to discover your art, you might as well just Xerox, photocopy everything else from the past, you know?
Yeah, I agree. But also there is like, again, quite dualistic approach to that, because I was participating in debates whether you probably then should not learn and like explore other techniques if you like. You know my position about Yahweh and so on, but I am extremely into biblistic and I'm reading all this Old Testament Kabbalah, this Zohar and so on. Yes, I totally disagree with ideas there quite a lot, but that helps me also to build up where I'm like where I can lean and where I can, I don't know, push myself forward from.
So one of the projects that I'm involved with at the moment, which is taking years to do, but I expected it to take years, is I'm doing a series of Kabbalistic path workings. And although I'm building a set of path workings which are based around the very sort of traditional tree of life, I'm doing it in such a way that there are very, very few references to particular cultures. There is no it's the encounter with the various spheres and the various paths use some of their imagery, but you wouldn't necessarily need to know anything about the Kabbalah for the system to work. Yeah. And the way that the imagery that I've used is designed to be really accessible to people. You wouldn't even necessarily, it would be helpful if you had a vague sense of the classic diagram. But beyond that, you don't necessarily need to know the names of Hebrew angels. You don't need to know the symbolism associated with the different areas. And for me, that's really important because yes, there are bits of the Kabbalah, there are bits of that structure that don't really work for me, or that I'm just ignorant of. If there are aspects of Hebrew Kabbalah, I don't speak or read Hebrew. If I wanted to learn more about that side of the tradition, I would either have to go and learn, or I would go to someone like Justin Sledge or one of the practitioners who I respect as a historian and writer and speaker about that, and I would learn from them. But I want to learn that so that I can create something that's new. I want to learn enough of the art materials that they're using so that I can build my own art. That's what I want to learn. In the same way that I want to learn a language so that I can speak the words that only I can speak. Yeah, those and that I think is quite important. So working with lots of different traditions is helpful, and where we find traditions or styles that don't speak to us, we don't necessarily have to go and learn those things, but there may be something interesting in that, particularly if we find a way that we can subvert something, change something, play with something,
Yes,
that's
I
part of the
agree.
reason that playfulness is really important as
That's
well.
why I sometimes read Michael W. Fort and Coyote.
Yeah.
But and also I recently found out this chaos approach of Michael W. Fort to chaos. That's also where it comes all this darkness into Russian occult, I guess, or brutalism in a cult.
I mean, some of this is so I don't know what the equivalent expression in the Russian language would be, but they're familiar with the expression to be an edgelord, to be so spooky, so terrifying, so powerful. Look,
I don't know
frankly,
if we have edgelord in Russia.
I'm sure you can find a decent translation, but just that idea of like, get a grip, right? You're a bag of mostly water on the third rock from the sun in a tiny little part of the galaxy. Don't think that you're so impressive or so powerful, because frankly, you're not. You're just a little creature, a little monkey. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that you don't matter, or that these things are not important, because they are. But I think that there's you can either be a genuine explorer of the mystery, or you can find yourself caught up in dressing in a certain kind of way, presenting yourself in a certain kind of a way. And again, you're rather like someone who's found a whole bunch of costumes that an actor would dress up in, But whether you're a good actor is a different question.
I agree with that. And this all these ego ideas that we have to either kill it or we like just inflate it by our solar magic and so on. It's a bit funny to me. For me, I've always been like I can just go from one extremum to another. There you understand that you're nothing like some monkey with anxiety on the rock, or you can be some kind of edge lord sometimes if you need to.
And there's, again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's rather like having a car that has gears. Yeah. So you don't want to be just stuck in one gear. The whole point about being a human, one of the interesting things about humans is humans are very, very adaptable, very flexible creatures, and so anything that kind of ends up with us becoming too rigid, too fixed in our ideas, it means that, we just know this. We know that when we are really fixed in a set of beliefs about the world, we miss a whole bunch of other stuff. We miss lots and lots of things. And so those rigid ideas, we either need mechanisms for periodically letting go of them, whether that's psychedelics or whether or not that's making fun of the things that we think are really important. That's another technique from Discordianism. So we need some way of like temporarily removing these things, or what we need to do is we need to practice being kind of flexible with this. We need to actually not become rigid in the first place and have to blow things apart. What we actually want to do is we want to, like when we do body work, when we work with our bodies, what we're trying to train is you're not going to never get disease. You're not going to not die. Like those things are pretty much guaranteed, whatever practice you do, right? That's guaranteed. But what you can do is you can try and be as flexible and as well as you can be given your circumstances. And magic is about change. One of the other definitions is magic is energy tending to change. The idea about the flexibility within magic and the ability of magic to allow us to see the world in a variety of different ways, that is a way of trying to stop us becoming rigid, stop us becoming fixed in our beliefs about the world.
Slightly Googled what can be edgelord in Russian, and usually it just says edgelord. Actually, I wonder what's edgelord in Russian, but for sure they are everywhere in Russian-speaking occults. But I didn't think of them as edgelords, but that's exactly the thing. What's brewing.
I think, see, this is one of the interesting things with chaos magic as well, was the idea that came along quite early on of banishing with laughter. So obviously, as you and I know, a common practice is at the end of a ritual, whatever you happen to do, everybody laughs, right? And there's several reasons for doing that. One reason is it's a good way of breaking the set, breaking the kind of, here's the paradigm, here's what we've been doing, here's our practice. Now we're just going to laugh. We're going to let it go. We're just going to, let it go and do its thing. Let it go into the unconscious mind, the deep mind, whatever. The other reason for laughing is there are several reasons. One reason is that if you have invented a style of practice, a style of occulture, a style of being in the world that doesn't allow you to laugh, this is like, I don't want to be part of your revolution if I can't dance, and I don't want to be part of your magic if I can't laugh. I'm not interested. Life can be difficult. Life can be, problematic enough without us creating for ourselves something that stops us being able to find the humor and the joy and the pleasure in the world. And also that laughter allows us to keep that flexibility again, like keep our minds open, and to keep finding ourselves opportunities to be with the mystery of the world and to laugh at the strangeness and wonderful nature of the world, rather than think that we figured it all out and that, the job is done.
Let's, yes. Can we banish that with laughter?
I think we should banish that with laughter. I think we're nearly at the end. I think we've nearly done it.
I agree. Well, I think we had a pretty full and quite fulfilling conversation. I don't know. What do you think?
I've enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much for inviting me. I hope it's not too difficult to translate.
I really don't know. It probably is. Well,
Sorry.
I don't know. There is some kind of automatic systems which I probably can correct or something if they pick up some. Let's try to do that. I don't know how it's
Good luck.
Yes, thank you. I hope I will find a way to ease that job. But I don't think we need that much editing. I mean, we just had a flow conversation, so I don't think we need some kind of cuts. So yeah.
That would be my hope. That would be my hope.
Yes, thank you. It was super pleasant and interesting in my opinion. And yeah, for me it was so reflexive that I really sometimes sounded with exactly even phrases. Sometimes like, okay, where am I? Where my ego?
Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me into the conversation. It's really, really appreciated. And yeah, thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you. And I will translate and let's see. But yeah, thank you and thank you for watching.
Thanks, everyone.
I certainly